Good afternoon. I'm sorry I can't be with you today, but I was very keen to tell some of our story. My name is William Balakrishnan, and I was the Programme Manager for the Services of Young People Transformation. So I was, if you like, the architect. If Gareth Simons, who was the Assistant Director, was going to live in the house, my job was probably to design it. And before I joined Surrey to undertake this challenge, I was a head of service for a London borough, and I'd recently been on a commissioning course at InLaGov at the University of Birmingham. And this sort of opened my mind to a new possibility of change which is commissioning. I think these ideas have become relatively commonplace now, but when we were doing this in 2010 they were very new, and one of the challenges we had to overcome was explaining this approach to colleagues. So I thought the best way to give you a flavour of how we approached our transformation challenge and how we approached that communications challenge would be to deliver one of the presentations from 2010 which I put together. This hopefully describes our approach well, and hopefully you have a slide back in front of you. I'm sure Chris and other colleagues who are there today can pick up any questions, or you can always get in touch with me later if you want to talk. So, Fit for the Future. So Fit for the Future was the name we gave to this transformation, because I think we felt it described where we wanted to go. But here's where we started from. This very complicated slide hopefully illustrates the scale of the challenge that we faced. Lots of stakeholders with vested interests in services, a financial challenge, which we'll talk about later, the needs of young people, we'll talk about our needs assessment later, but a lot of key things that we found out that weren't being addressed through our current services. Some organisational challenges. We're a political organisation, so we also face some political challenges. We had some underutilised, mixed quality, but loved by the community youth clubs, and a very powerful voluntary sector. So all of this added up to a challenge that we probably couldn't address in the traditional ways that we've done before, which would be thinking of what are the individual actions we need to do to address these challenges. Instead, we needed a bigger approach. And as I said, the approach that I was keen to look at was transformation. We had a big financial challenge, so we've got options. We've got the options which we've used in the past, which is sometimes called salami slicing. I think what that really means is slowly chipping away, reducing budgets until you're left with a service which maybe doesn't resemble what it was, isn't well liked by the community, and crucially, we don't know what outcomes that service is actually delivering. It just sort of exists. So I think our other option, which was the option that we chose, was to transform. How did we transform? Well, we looked at a commissioning approach. Now, I'm sure colleagues have talked to you about commissioning, and you know that commissioning is often a cycle. I think when you're doing commissioning for the first time, it actually probably looks a bit more like a straight line. Once you're in the cycle, you can start at any given point within it, but before you've been there, you have to start like this. And what was the key things, sorry, I'm getting some boring emails there, ignore those, was we started off with resources allocated to services. By that I mean, we know how much our youth service costs, we know how much our youth justice service costs, and it delivers stuff for that envelope. Where we wanted to go was that resources are allocated to outcomes, and this is the approach we took. Needs, outcomes, options, business case, implement. How did we know we were going to be successful? So we know what we want to do, which is impact on outcomes. But before we've been through the process, we don't know which outcomes are most important. We don't know which outcomes that we wanted to achieve because we didn't understand need well enough. So we had to set some success factors which were a bit more about quality. And actually, I was looking at these not 2 days ago and thinking, well, actually, these still really resonate with me. And these are still things that I think we haven't quite cracked in the wider directorate. So I've got a wider directorate role now, so people might be seeing these again. Integrated, preventative, targeted, local, and value for money. So if that's what our world looked like after the transformation, we thought that would be a success. So we're going to talk in a bit about something called 1 in 10, which was our needs assessment, but effectively we had 100,000 young people, 10,000 of which we thought were at risk of not making a successful transition to adulthood. This is how we saw the world might look, a different approach. If we're commissioners, our relationship with young people and providers needs to change. So what often happens in more of a contracting relationship is the relationship at the bottom starts to become the most important. And we've seen that with contracts. We had a contract at the time with something called Connections, which was a phone book. And in it, everything was specified to the nth degree, even how high a sign was off the floor. What that means is that because we've got to look at all of that all the time, our relationship with the provider becomes the most important relationship. It becomes the most important relationship for the provider because they want money and they want to be seen to be doing a good job, and it becomes the most important relationship for us because we're invested all this time in this complicated spec and we want to hold them to account. I think a commissioning approach removes that. I think a commissioning approach changes our relationship. Obviously there's some money being transferred, but what we want back from the provider is outputs and outcomes, and we want the provider to deliver the services in whatever way they see fit. And deliver that in co-production with young people. I'm sure we'll talk about co-production later, but co-production really means there is some reciprocity, there is some give and take. It's not just giving a service to somebody, it's working with them, it's designing something with them, and it's delivering something which uses all of the things in their life to complement what we're doing. That means our relationship in terms of judging, are these services any good, needs to change. And that's what we've tried to illustrate here. We needed a better conversation with young people to tell us if our services were actually any good. Here's the financial challenge. Significant. So from 18 million to 12 million, 1/3 of the budget. So clearly we weren't able to do things in the same way. Right, let's talk about needs. So the first step in our commissioning journey is our needs assessment, and we produced one. It was the first ever needs assessment on young people in Surrey. It was comprehensive, it looked at all aspects of young people's lives, 1 in 10, and it was actually quite a seminal moment for the transformation. What's next? Indicative outcomes. So we now understand need, we understand what is happening for young people, what they're experiencing, what positive outcomes, but also what negative outcomes they're experiencing. So we need to build an outcomes framework to inform what it is we want to do. And if commissioning is matching resources to need to deliver outcome, then we need a consensus between all of us on which outcomes are most important. I think something I've seen elsewhere is that it's very easy to identify outcomes. But it's very difficult to say, well, which are most important, which are going to have the biggest impact? What hierarchy can we put in place to understand the interrelationship? And that's actually quite difficult work, particularly when we've got such a range of people who have outcomes already. They have both desired outcomes, things they want to see happen, and they have outcomes in their corporate plans, in their strategies. Also, we've got the views of a number of people. Our politicians, our elected members, the young people themselves, practitioners, partners. Also, we've now built a big load of evidence. So we looked at all of that and started to build an indicative outcomes framework. And this was an early version. It actually got iterated on from here. But this is an early version of what we were looking at. And we thought economic well-being should be at the top. We thought young people participating was important and that their social well-being was important. And this starts to inform our thinking. Right, next up, options. So, we've got some outcomes now and we've got some resource, a limited resource. So what we're trying to do, and this I think is the crucial part of the journey, is imagine there are no services. If we were redesigning this system if nothing had existed before, how would we deliver the outcomes that we want with the resources that we have? So we knew we were probably going to have some blocks. There is going to be some casework. We want to prevent something happening in a local way. We want maybe something which all people in the county can access that is preventative. But we also, and I think a very forgotten piece of commissioning, is sometimes you just need to change the system around you, which I call systems change. Options appraisals are really challenging, and I think they're really challenging when you're trying to options appraise something which doesn't exist yet. So how can I know the value for money for something which has never been done before? And crucially, how can I convince my finance colleagues, whose job it is to make sure that we're spending money efficiently and effectively, how can I give them some comfort and give them some proof that what I'm going to do is going to be better than what I was doing before? Well, I'm afraid I can't answer all of those questions, but this was the approach that we took. We had 3 areas that we looked at. Social, how good is the proposed option going to be at affecting outcome? Strategic, how well does it fit with the rest of what we're doing? And financial, not just how much does it cost, but what is the unit cost? What is the cost per outcome? And is there going to be some wider social benefits, some wider social return on investment? So I'll try and give you a flavour of what we sort of ended up with. And we'll talk about some of these in a moment. We looked at our options and we generated a business case, and the business case obviously looked at the options that we had. Casework options, so these are the types of things we looked at and said, well, if we're allocating this set of outcomes and this set of resource to a vehicle, how do we know which one's best? Well, these are the ones we looked at: joint ventures, cooperatives, in-house and contracts. The challenge isn't thinking of these things. The challenge is sort of proving or disproving which is going to have the biggest effect on outcomes, back to our options appraisal criteria. Something very exciting was the youth services contract framework. So here we said, well, actually, we're not going to design services at all. What we're going to do is we're going to create a marketplace of providers, some of them are here, local to each of our little regions of Surrey, and we're going to say, providers, here are the following needs. How would you address them? You know the community. We don't want to prescribe a way of doing things. You all have your own strengths and weaknesses. What we do want is a theory of change, something that gives us comfort that we're actually going to deliver. But it's up to you. What you need to tell us is how much you're going to do and how many outcomes you're going to deliver. Rather innovative. There were some other options that we looked at. We ended up with this framework, but we could have done it in-house. We could have just given grants, or we could have just had a single contract, but it didn't really look good to us. Skill centres were interesting. They were about what would be the best way of using our youth estate. How could we maximise the value? So going back to our options appraisal criteria earlier, how could we maximise the value of those things? So we ended up with this idea called skill centres. Outdoor education, similar. We have these outdoor education centres. How can we maximise the value and the benefit from them? Well, it probably looks like a social enterprise. Youth engagement contract was rather exciting. So remember earlier I was saying we needed to have a different conversation with our young people. Well, we also needed to be able to give young people information. We need to understand their feedback. We needed to market to them, tell them about the services. And we wanted to encourage more participation. So we came up with the idea of a youth engagement contract where maybe the metric might be different than it has been before. So this wasn't just about building a website. This was about saying, how many young people can you engage with? And how many of these things can you do? But we're not going to prescribe the way you do it. So those are some of the options we looked at. So we've seen this slide before. We ended up with a commissioning function which had a number of vehicles underneath it. So what does that make our job? Well, we were moving from being service providers to commissioners. So what role did we see for ourselves? Well, we think this was the role of the commissioner we thought of in 2010. Needs, provision quality, stakeholders, cost analysis, market analysis. And actually, we've only just created this. So one of the reasons I'm back in Surrey is I'm now the head of Insight and Innovation. I'm part of a directorate-wide commissioning team, which is the first one we've had in Surrey and something I'm very excited about. We can then inform our commissioning process over there. So I hope that was helpful. Sorry if it's a bit technical in places, but hopefully it gives you a flavour of the journey we went on. And as I say, I'm sure other colleagues are going to give you a view now on whether it's successful or not. But thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll meet again.